He talked of land reform, making him one of the early champions of the idea of modern Iran. He talked of making education available to every Iranian. Many of these measures would, in later years, become pillars of Mohammed Reza Shah's reform programs. Seyed and his ally, Reza Khan, often declared that fighting communism and aborting a Bolshevik revolution in Iran was their chief purpose and the foundation of their ideology. At the same time, Seyed became a relentless advocate of the necessity of the rapprochement between Iran and its new Soviet neighbor, leading to the 1921 agreement between Iran and the Soviet Union. The agreement ended upon hostilities between the two countries, but its infamous Article 5 stipulated that if Iran were ever used as a staging area for anti-Soviet aggression, the Soviets would have the right to enter Iran and address the threat. From the outset, there was something amiss in Saeed Zia's attempt to don the mantle of a dictator. It soon became clear that nearly all actual power was in the hands of Reza Khan, and every new sign of Saeed's weakness further emboldened the increasing ranks of his enemies. One of the most embittered foes was the king himself. Saeed's attitude, defiant, filled with self-importance, and unabashed in the use of the rhetorical devices of revolution, was evident in his treatment of the king, as well as in his first pronouncement as the head of the coup cabinet. In a long, meandering text, he wrote of how fate has designed me to take in hand the destinies of my people in this dangerous crisis, and to save it from the abyss, to the edge of which will-less and unworthy governments have brought it. He attacked the few hundred nobles who had the reins of power by inheritance, and who sucked leech-like the blood of the people. Seyed had always been defiantly oblivious to the court's solemnities and the rules of etiquette for a royal audience. More than once he had walked into an audience with the king casually dressed, with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He had flouted protocol by sitting down before he was granted permission by His Majesty. In reprisal, Ahmad Shah had ordered all chairs removed from his office. In the next meeting, Seyed found an even better way to insult the king he despised. He sat on the windowsill throughout the audience. Ahmad Shah was incensed and practically threw the prime minister out of the office. Before long he joined forces with Seyed's many enemies and arranged for his dismissal. Reza Khan was only too happy to abide by the king's wishes. The British did everything in their power to keep Seyed in power, and in the words of the Quadras, and by temperament, he was insatiably ambitious. In 1921, he was the governor of Khorasan province, but his appetite for power seemed to have no limit. Seyed ordered him arrested and brought to Tehran. But before he arrived in the capital, Seyed had fallen, and Qavam was appointed prime minister. Mohammed Reza was but 3 years old when his father became the war minister in Qavam's cabinet. Early in his tenure as prime minister, on the occasion of the Persian New Year, Qavam paid a courtesy visit to Reza Khan's house. As is customary in such visits, the older Qavam sat the 3-year-old Mohammed Reza on his lap, whispered sweet nothings in his ears, and gave him a gold coin, an ashrafi, as Eid or New Year's gift. Giving cash and coins on such occasions was in those days, when toys and other commodities were a rarity in Iran, nothing usual. Almost exactly 20 years later, the two met again. By this time, that boy had grown into a king, and Kavam was granted an audience to be appointed again as prime minister. He had spent many of the years in between these two meetings in exile. He had allegedly hired two assassins to kill Reza Khan. No sooner had he walked into the Shah's office than the wily and ironic Kavam is reported to have said, Masha Allah, praise God, your majesty has surely grown since I last saw you. But in 1921, Kavam's rapid fall and rise were the direct result of Seyed's hubris. Though real power was in the hands of Reza Khan, Seyed behaved more and more like a dictator. The ranks of his enemies swelled, and his days in office were now numbered. Exactly 100 days after his appointment as prime minister, Seyed Zia was, to the relief of his detractors, dismissed from the post. His last meeting with Ahmad Shah, a dedicated foe of Seyed, took place only days before Seyed's dismissal. Not long after leaving Iran in 1921, Seyed was peddling Persian carpets in the bustling street corners of Weimar Berlin. He then settled in the aristocratic quiet of Montreux in Switzerland. As he later confessed in an interview, in the days and months after leaving Iran, grief and anger sometimes tore asunder his facade of calm. I would take cold showers, he said, and scream in anger at my fate. Back in Tehran, his ex-partner, Reza Khan, was methodically climbing the political ladder. Not long after Seyed's dismissal, Reza Khan issued an unusually long declaration setting out the reasons why he had undertaken the coup and declaring that henceforth, if any paper or magazine suggested that anyone other than him was the coup's mastermind, that paper would be banned and the journalist punished. At the same time, he began amassing an illicit fortune, a habit that proved to be his Achilles heel as a ruler. The British embassy reported that on more than one occasion, Reza Khan used the coercive power of his office to purchase land and property in Tehran and other places around the country at a fraction of their real price. In March 1925, for example, the embassy reported that Reza Khan added to his already extensive estates in Mazandaran by purchasing more land to the value of 800,000 tuman, in those days a considerable fortune. Changes in Reza Khan's fortune meant changes in his son's life. More money brought more opulence, while more power brought a more constricted life for Mohammed Reza. As the family moved to a bigger house in a more prosperous section of the city, his father insisted on choosing his son's friends. His closest friend, aside from his twin sister, who in a desperate attempt to endear herself to her brother, became more and more of a tomboy, was Majid Alam. He was chosen because his father was a court physician, and Reza Khan wanted his son mingling only with the children of the elite. But the games they played were those enjoyed by any normal children at the time: hide-and-seek, cops and robbers, and soccer. More than once, Alam remembered wistfully, I had, while playing, pushed or shouted at the future king or his twin sister. Reza Khan was still the prime minister when he asked the parliament to pass the law of identity and personal status. All titles, military or civilian, inherited or purchased, were to be abolished. Every Iranian male was now asked to choose and register a family name for himself and his family. Hitherto, people had been known by their first names, followed by a nickname reflecting their infirmity, their profession, or their town or privilege of birth. For his own family name, Reza Khan picked Pahlavi, the name of the pre-Islamic language of Persia. For Reza Khan, being a rich and powerful prime minister was no longer enough. With the help of other charismatic officers, he had successfully put down all the rebellious forces around the country and forced a unified Iran. Of these rebels, the most sensitive case was surely that of Sheikh Khazal. The British were, in the words of their ambassador, placed in a most embarrassing position. On the one hand stood our definite assurances to the Sheikh, on the other our desire to see and help a strong and stable central government in Persia. Reza Khan assured the ambassador that in arresting the Sheikh and dismantling his fiefdoms, he was in fact doing the Sheikh a good turn. Reza Khan toyed with the idea of turning Iran into a republic, with himself as the first president, but then he was already a fan of Ataturk in Turkey and was interested in emulating his success in changing the Islamic Ottoman Sultanate into a militantly secular Republic of Turkey. But a combination of forces, including his political enemies and his critics in the political establishment, as well as some in the ranks of the Iranian clergy, ever watchful of the dangers of creeping secularism, opposed the idea. It was not that difficult to convince Reza Khan to change his mind. Even more than the presidency, he now coveted the throne. In December 1924, the British Embassy, which closely monitored events in Tehran, offered this succinct summary of the changes that were taking place. A movement has been worked up during the last few days for a crowd to stop Prime Minister Reza Khan carriage on his imminent return here and insist on taking him to palace to be crowned Shah. I do not think the Persian government is privy to this. It is significant that Persian divisional commanders in the provinces have been secretly warned of probable impending changes. Their previous instructions were to pave the way for a republic. These are now suspended. From early 1925, Reza Khan began to make it increasingly clear that he cannot continue to work effectively in the present conditions and that the country must now choose between him and the Shah. By then, Ahmad Shah, the sitting king, who had been spending his time gambling and investing, often with disastrous results in the European stock market, was itching to come home again, but had grown frightened of Reza Khan. The British had lost all hope and respect for Ahmad Shah. One of their diplomats rallied against his contemptible cowardice, avarice, and treachery. And when the embarrassingly weak and vacillating king approached the British embassy in Paris with a request for British advice whether he should return to Persia or not, the same reply had been returned to His Majesty as was given to him last year, viz., that the question of his return to Persia was a purely internal one, that the British government was unwilling to be involved in any way in the issue. About the same time, Ahmad Shah sent his crown prince, who despised his father and used every opportunity to take his place, to visit the British legation in Tehran and ask the personal views of the ambassador about the possibility of Ahmad Shah's return. But the answer in Tehran was no different than that in Paris. The ambassador declared that he was shocked to be asked for such advice, and declined to be involved in this purely internal question. During these weeks of turmoil and tension in Tehran and in most other major cities, Reza Khan apparently instigated mass demonstrations against the return of the Shah. Both Ahmad Shah and Reza Khan clearly understood this to be the death knell of the Qajar dynasty. In the mind of Reza Khan, the last hurdle between him and the throne was the support of the British government. He knew well that Qajar kings and princes had for a long time enjoyed the support and sometimes the largesse of the British government. By late 1925, he had set the stage to get rid of the Qajars, but in the words of the British embassy, he still fears disapproval of His Majesty's government. Britain had maintained a studied silence on his activities, and Reza Khan had interpreted this as a sign of their discontent and their continued support for the Qajar dynasty. The British ambassador arranged a meeting with a close confidant of Reza Khan and sent him a message. Reza Khan should not, the message said, hope for more than loyal and friendly attitude of strict non-interference by the British. This message of neutrality was music to Reza Khan's anxious ears. He could now make his final move. In his march to power and to the throne, his most important move was to convince the Parliament to pass a law on February 12, 1925, that made him the supreme commander of all defensive and security forces of the country. Hitherto, that title had been the monopoly of the king, and it did not take Reza Khan long to use his position as the commander-in-chief to become king himself. This experience had a profound impact on his son. Mohammed Reza had helped shape one of the central tenets of his own later political vision. In Iran, the Shah believed the military is the key to power, and if a king wants to have any political relevance or even remain in power, he must keep not just the titular role of commander-in-chief, but the actual and practical command of the armed forces. By October 31st, 1925, Reza Khan was ready to make his last move. He set the stage for the Majlis, Parliament, to pass a resolution abolishing the Qajar dynasty, making him the head of a provisional government, and ordered elections for a constituent assembly. Only 4 deputies, each fulsome in their praise of Reza Khan as prime minister, voted against the abolition of the Qajar dynasty, and all went on to play crucial roles in the life of the future king, Mohammed Reza Shah. On December 12, 1925, the Constituent Assembly voted to name Reza Khan the new king and make his male descendants heir to the throne. When news of the change was still When news of the change was sent to the Foreign Office, the minister wrote on the margin of the report, "The new dynasty, if it survives the first generation, will be purely Persian, whereas the Qajar were Turkish and remain Turkish." In fact, it had been hundreds of years since the Persian family ruled Iran. Both the Qajar and the Safavid dynasties, who together ruled Iran for over 4 centuries, were Turkish. On January 14th, 1926, the day after his coronation, Reza Shah signed a decree conferring the title of Valet ad Crown Prince on his oldest son, Mohammed Reza Pahlavi. He was 6 years old.